Hello, hello. Uh, Welcome to the Regrid webcast semi-regular series. My name is Nick Downer, VP of Software over here at Regrid. And I am excited to introduce Ori, who is here with us from Urban3. Ori, do you mind doing just sort of a quick intro of yourself and what you do over at Urban3?
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks for the kind of introduction, Nick. My name is Ori Baber. I'm an analyst with the firm Urban3. We're headquartered in Asheville, North Carolina. We're a land use economics planning firm specializing in kind of data visualization, data-driven storytelling, policy development. We work with clients all over the US and internationally. Joined the Urban3 team, nearly a year ago, but have been working with them on and off since about 2017. So I was working for the city of Gainesville down in Florida. I was on city staff, actually brought the Urban3 team in to do an extensive land use economics study for us to help kind of inform a strategic plan that we were doing. And so that was kind of how I was introduced to Urban3, and the rest is history, I guess. So my background is kind of an interesting interface between data science is kind of the umbrella underneath which I work, but then my specialized training is actually in the field of kind of public health. So that's where I kind of work across the planning and public health realm using data science as the bridge between the two.
Cool. And I have to say, I'm really stoked that we're able to do this and that you're able to join us here, because I feel like from the time that we first started talking together, sort of about the over and under assessment stuff, I was like, man, we gotta do this on sort of like a public stage so others can hear it too, because I think it's on the Regrid side, it really gets to a lot of the things that we care about and sort of speaks to the issues of the day. But I think it's also really timely in that there's a lot of emerging research, as you obviously know, sort of around these types of sort of over and under assessments and how value and taxes impact people's lives, right? And I think, without getting too sort of like feel good or cliche about it, I think there's really like a world where sort of this data analysis can really be used to make average people's lives better, right? And so I think, sort of on all fronts, we're really happy to have you here. And, the stuff you've been working on, which I'm excited to sort of hand over to you in a second here to talk more about, really hits the intersection for us where it's like cool data presented interestingly, and also really has just like a super interesting sort of like implications for sort of like how do you translate that into the real world, right? So, yeah, go ahead.
I was going to say, just thanks for the opportunity to do this. I think we've uncovered some interesting stuff here in our local county of Buncombe County, and we've been somewhat on a little bit of a local roadshow, so sharing it with local organizations. So I appreciate the opportunity to kind of bring this to your audience and share our findings with you all.
Absolutely. And I think with that, let's get into it. So can you maybe just like set the scene here and talk a little bit about, as you just said, right, Buncombe County, Asheville, I believe is largest city within it, right? County seat?
Yep. So Asheville is the county seat. So I'm in Asheville right now. Our firm is headquartered here. General kind of setting the scene, as you said, right? So our county recently reassessed all of the properties in Buncombe County. So we've got about 130,000 parcels in Buncombe County. Went through about a year-long process to reassign values to each of those properties in Buncombe County. I'll get into this in a little bit of the presentation, but we've got some kind of backdrop, some local resolutions that were passed. And so our firm, kind of specializing in this field of land use economics, decided to take some time and just look at how this reappraisal process played out, and kind of what that means for our residents, our neighbors, our community members, ourselves, right? And so we kind of embarked on this journey that's really uncovered some interesting findings. So that's kind of the backdrop to this.
Yeah, and let's get into it. Before we do, I just wanted to quickly note too, if anybody watching live is interested, has a question or whatever, feel free to drop it in the chat there on the right-hand side, and then we'll do our best to sort of get to it as we can. So with that, Ori, please go ahead. I'm stoked to look at some of this stuff.
Cool. So while I'm pulling this up, Nick, just as a reminder, I'm going to lose video on you, so feel free to interject if I'm, rambling a little bit too much. But
sure.
Click. And then should be good. So Nick, can you see my screen?
Yeah, looking good. Yep.
Okay. Yep. So, right, the kind of title presentation, right, unequal property tax assessment, specifically looking at Buncombe County. So, what I've been doing to kind of kick these presentations off is just starting with a really quick kind of property tax 101, right? Because we know that different jurisdictions, different states have slightly different or nuanced ways that they approach their property tax administration. So here locally, I'll kind of run through the basics for North Carolina. We're fairly fortunate in the sense that we've got a fairly straightforward property tax system, kind of legislated system. At its most fundamental level, really, it's just the assessed value of a property multiplied by the local jurisdiction's tax rate. So if this is the county's tax rate or the city of Asheville's tax rate, yields the property tax bill. So that's how much an individual property owner would be paying annually in property taxes. So in North Carolina, the assessed value is supposed to be equivalent to the fair market value. So homes and properties are assessed at 100% fair market value. And I'll talk through the distinction between those two throughout the rest of this kind of presentation. So first kind of takeaway specifically to Buncombe County, assessed value should equal market value. And I use the word should here, and we'll talk through why. The other thing is, that idea of fair market value. So if we're going to reassign value to properties in Buncombe County, not every property transacts or gets sold in the market in any given year. So what ends up happening is sales that do occur, that data is then used to extrapolate the value to other homes, similar homes in the neighborhood, in the area. And that's the process known as kind of computer-assisted math appraisal, which takes sales and market data and helps determine those assessed values in the county. So just kind of a quick hypothetical situation here. Let's say we've got a home in 2017 that was assessed or assigned a value of about $300,000. So in Buncombe County, that assessed value will carry forward every tax year until a new reassessment happens. So for a 4-year period, this individual property owner would be paying taxes on a $300,000 home. That's the assessed value, right? This is different than market value. So Asheville, Buncombe County, our real estate sector is really continuing to take off. So that same home in 2017 may have sold on the market for $300,000, but in 2018, you may be able to fetch a little bit more for it on the market, a little bit more, and such that by 2021, let's say that home is now able to fetch maybe $350,000 on the market. So then when this reappraisal happens in 2021, instead of being reappraised at $300,000, going through that process of reappraisal bumps the value, the assessed value, up to $350,000. It's more fair market value. So that's generally the process that we're looking at here, that we've looked at and kind of assessed in this particular work we've done recently. So just to kind of dial that in, here in Buncombe County, really in all of North Carolina, counties are required to do this reassessment at least every 8 years, at least. Buncombe County has adopted a 4-year schedule. So our last reappraisal happened in 2017, and then again earlier this year in 2021. So what we effectively have done is looked at the change in kind of assessed values between 2017 and 2021. So those are the 3 big kind of takeaways, right, from this kind of introductory property tax 101. I mentioned that there's some kind of background context to this work specifically for Buncombe County. So you all that are tuning in may be familiar with Buncombe County or Asheville for a number of different reasons, right? It's a great tourism hub, but most recently, we've kind of gained some local recognition or national recognition based off of being among the first jurisdictions to pass reparations for Black residents in Buncombe County and in Asheville. So kind of led some of the initial conversations around reparations. This is about mid-2020. And then we did this county-wide reassessment. So Urban3 effectively, we saw the reassessment come out and we asked the question, how does this reassigning value to all 130,000 parcels in Buncombe County. How does that relate to these objectives that we have committed to as a community, specifically around race equity? And so that's kind of the backdrop to the work. We started this work in kind of an exploratory way. We call this a pick and poke analysis, where we find some properties that we're familiar with, be it our own or our neighbors, and we just kind of look at how this reassessment process played out. So I'll start with one of those properties that we started with. So this house in Brown is actually my boss's house, Joe Minicozy, the founder of Urban3. So we looked at his property, and we also took his neighbors, the Lordmans. So the Lordmans are a long-term resident of this particular neighborhood. This is a historic Montford neighborhood. African-American family, military veterans, living on fixed income, unfortunately experiencing a couple of chronic health conditions that limit their mobility. And so our first comparison was just to kind of look at Joe's duplex versus his neighbors, and I'll show you some of those numbers right here. So we'll look at 68 Cortland is the Lordmans. This is Joe's neighbors, and I'll kind of work through a couple different examples, and we'll look at three metrics that right off the bat we wanted to look at to be able to compare this reassessment process. We look at land value per acre for the Lordmans is about $500,000. We look at building value per square foot, $127 per square foot, and then this percent change is the amount that the valuation changed between 2017 and 2021. So we see the Lordmans increased in value by about 117%. So keeping that in mind, the Lordmans are here in the Montford neighborhood. We decided to pick out another property. This is equivalent to moving closer to the beach if you're, in a coastal community or more close to waterfront properties. This is Kimberly Avenue, another very well-established neighborhood. We're looking at a home that, faces the Grove Park Country Club. This is a luxury golf club right there on the 9th hole. So this is the house. This is the view. It's right along a neighborhood street that's got undergrounded utilities and 10 to 12 foot sidewalks, and obviously a pretty gorgeous view. So the house, the view, right? We can look at those same sort of metrics or indicators for this particular property. And what we see is land value per acre for this property is $447,000 per acre. Building square foot's about $107 per square foot. And we see about 106% change. And we can put those side by side back with the Lordmans, right? And just kind of look across these two. So difference in land value per acre. The Lordmans are, valued at about 50 grand more per acre in just their land value. The Lordman's home is assessed at, $20 more per square foot. I just want to kind of call your attention to the two pictures of these homes and ask whether or not you would expect the Lordman's home to be priced at $20 more per square foot when you just look at these two pictures. And then the percent change between, the reappraisal years. This house on Kimberly Avenue only increased by 106%. Again, the Lordman's increased by 119%. And we can also look at how much they're actually paying in just county property taxes alone. We do this on a per acre analysis just to be able to compare apples to apples. So Kimberly Ave home paying $9 grand in property taxes, Cortland paying about 10 grand in property taxes annually. So let's look at one more property. Oh, before I do that, while we're in the process of just doing this pick and poke analysis, this home on Kimberly Avenue actually sold for $765,000. And if you look at its assessed taxable value of $495,000, right, this effectively an indicator of its market value, right, is considerably higher than its assigned taxable value. So it's being taxed effectively at 60% of its sale price, which I'll talk about more in a second. But let's look at one more property. So here's that Kimberly Avenue house. If we go across the golf course up to the top of the mountain to this mountaintop, this is effectively beachfront realty up here, right down the street from the governor's mansion. This is the property we're looking at. It's got its own tennis court. It's quite a large single-family home. So let's look at those same kind of indicators across the board here. So land value per acre for this mountaintop tennis court house is $83,000 per acre. Kimberly Ave at $447, and then the Lordman's at nearly $500,000 per acre. And if we just look at the difference in the amount of property taxes paid per acre, we're talking about $4,000 per acre for the mountaintop tennis court home, $9,000 per acre for the Kimberly Avenue home, and then kind of an astonishing $10,000 per acre for the Lordman's home in Montford. So right off the bat, I mentioned that was kind of like the pick and poke approach to this work, is where we go through when we just look at a handful of properties, and doing that alone led us to feel like there may be some kind of curiosities that may need further exploration. So we decided, rather than just doing this piece by piece, let's go ahead and take this county-wide. That's within our wheelhouse. This is kind of what we do on a day-to-day basis. So we took the entire county and we looked specifically just at the residential properties for this analysis. And so, providing just, again, some kind of backdrop, we decided to do a sales ratio analysis. And I mentioned that our state statutes require that homes be assessed at 100% their fair market value, right? So if we look at a sales ratio, which is basically just dividing the assessed value by its market value, its most recent selling price, gives you the sales ratio. So here, 1-to-1 ratio means that we're being assessed at fair market value. There are situations, right, where a home may be overassessed, right? But this is a situation in which the assessed value is greater than its fair market value. So your sales ratio would be greater than 1. And then a situation in which a property may be underassessed is when the assessed value is lower than its fair market value. So the big distinction between being overassessed and underassessed is, if you're overassessed, that means you're effectively paying kind of an unfair higher amount of property taxes than if you were to be assigned at fair market value. Underassessed, you're effectively receiving a form of tax subsidy in which you're paying only a fraction of the amount of property taxes that you should if you were being assessed at fair market value. So with this in mind, what we did is we did a kind of comprehensive countywide analysis, and we looked at transactions over the last 20 years effectively and compared them to the assessed value to its most recent sale price. And what we ended up finding is that homes on the lower end of the value spectrum were being overassessed fairly routinely, and that homes on the higher end of the value spectrum were being consistently underassessed. And so there's a kind of a trade-off point. The tipping point is right around $225,000, such that if you owned a home $225,000 and under, generally what we observed was that homes were being overassessed, and vice versa. If you owned a home over $225,000, generally you were being underassessed. And so I'll talk through kind of the implications and the ramifications of this disparity that we see in a second. But what we were also able to do is just track the change in value of these kind of an initial cohort of homes over a 20-year, like 2-decade period, essentially. We've been to the homes by kind of their starting value. So what we found is that the lowest value homes to begin with in 2001 increased by nearly 323%, while the highest 20% of homes only increased by 138%. So this is kind of a year-over-year compounding trend that we see. And the problem that we're experiencing in Buncombe County, that's a very pronounced and real problem. I mean, not only here in Buncombe County, but I'm sure everyone can kind of relate to the situation that when we see the value of homes increasing this dramatically, but we compare that to the change in median income in Buncombe County, our median income has only increased by 36%. CPI at the same time frame has only increased by nearly 50%. So I think this really illustrates one of the mechanisms that's at play here when we talk about housing affordability in Buncombe County. But what's even perhaps more astonishing is when we take the buildings off of the property and we just look at the change in land value across time. So same cohort of homes, and we look at just the change in land that's underneath them. We see that the lowest 20% that land increased by nearly 700% over a 20-year time frame, while the highest value homes will increase by 153%. So I think this really kind of begs the question of like what's at play here that we would see such a dramatic increase at the lower end of the spectrum and a fairly moderate increase on the higher end of the spectrum. So these are the two numbers, right? Total value, land value, binned by quintile, if you will. But what we also pulled during this process was appeal data. So in the process of getting values reassigned, a property owner has the opportunity to submit a formal appeal and basically say, hey, I think the valuation process or the value that my property's been assigned is off. I have more information about the property, or I'd like you to take a closer look. And what we ended up seeing is that homeowners of more valuable homes were far more likely to engage and then be successful in the appeals process. And the appeals process tends to move in the direction of kind of deflating the value of the home. So we see a lot of activity in the higher end of the spectrum here. And so I think, what I've shown so far kind of illustrates a trend of perhaps an economic bias in which there's burdens being placed on perhaps lower income families, lower valued homeowners. But we, like I mentioned in the beginning, we as a community kind of made commitments to advance race equity in Buncombe County. So we also wanted to look at this from a kind of a race equity perspective. And what I'm showing here is just a simple distribution of home values by homeowner race. So I'm just showing Black or African American in blue, and then white homeowners in green. And effectively what this just shows is that, white homeowners tend to own homes that are on average about 20 to 40% more valuable than Black or African American homeowners in Buncombe County. And so when we layer on that kind of that J curve, right, the under overassessed, who is more likely to feel the impacts of the overassessment of lower valued homes. By and large, this is our communities of color in Buncombe County. And so we see this as a pretty stark indication of also a race bias, a race disparity in the property tax assessment process. So I mentioned we did this countywide, so I just kind of want to show some quick graphics that we can talk through, but this is just change in land value throughout the entire county, parcel by parcel. We were able to layer on change in building value on top of that, and then kind of zoom in and look at this neighborhood by neighborhood. So here we are looking at a neighborhood that's just on the kind of north side of downtown Asheville. And what I'm showing is percent change in land value from 2020 to 2021. And light green is low percent change, dark green is high percent change. And then I've extruded by that same percent change. So higher peak indicates higher percent change. And this was really kind of an astonishing graphic to put together for a number of different reasons, and I'll walk you through why. One, I think the big thing that caught our eyes that we've got down here in the Montford area, we've got neighborhoods, we've got homes that are immediately adjacent to each other that are demonstrating very different changes in land value because of this reappraisal process. And we know that, living here as residents of the Montford neighborhood, we know Montford neighborhood is this kind of larger geographic footprint. So this was a curiosity to see such stark changes. The other thing that was really kind of interesting is that all of these parcels were assigned the same percent change in land value. So you can see these clusters are all elevating at the same percent change. And so that then kind of led to some additional questions about the mechanics of the reassessment process and what these kind of clusters mean, if you will. So I'll talk through that in a little bit. But our office is here where I've indicated with a star. If we were to just walk across the highway into that neighborhood that I was talking about down Flint Street, right, and just look at two of these homes side by side. So one that's seen dramatic increase versus one that is not increasing. These are those two homes, right, side by side. So 96 Flint Street, right, 98 Flint Street, with a kind of an arbitrary neighborhood boundary in between. On one side of this arbitrary boundary, we see a 316% increase in land value. On the other side, we see a 102% increase in land value. And what I'll what I'll point to. This arbitrary boundary is actually a kind of an artifact in the math that's used to assign value. This line right here indicates a tax neighborhood boundary, which is effectively a grouping of homes that's produced to develop the assessed value. I'll talk more about that here in a quick second. Then if you're like me, I know I'm moving through this kind of quick, but I want to leave time for some conversation here on the tail end. But we got to this point and we asked, all right, how are some of these disparities or anomalies happening? And basically what we did is we grouped our findings into kind of three big categories. One is algorithmic bias, one is human bias, and then we're dealing with situations in which we have structural inequity from decades of historical policy that's been implemented based on kind of racial or class constructs. And so I'll talk through algorithmic, human bias, and structural inequity real quick. So,
hey, Ori, real quick,
yeah,
I have a question for you. So we had a question, and just before you dive into the biases, can you just talk a little bit about the source of the data that we're looking at here in Buncombe?
Yeah. Great question. Yeah, so we are fortunate we had a relationship with our local tax assessor, and so we were able to request a lot of this data directly from our local tax assessor. As part of, I should also mention this, as part of the kind of race equity work that our county had been engaged in, there was a push to build more transparency in the data process. So one outcome of that was an open data portal here for our county that we were able to pull some of this data from. So by and large, most of this came from a direct request to our county assessor. And that's basically the data that we're working with. So both the parcel geographies and then the tax roll data are coming from our assessor.
Cool, thanks.
Cool, yep. So yeah, then, like I said, diving into kind of the questions of why and how does this happen? And I will caveat this and say this might be somewhat of an oversimplification, but I think it does help kind of communicate some of perhaps the deficiencies in the math that are currently being used. So we're just looking at right now a distribution of our home values in Buncombe County. So our homes tend to, kind of center at about $250,000 to $300,000 is our average home value in Buncombe County. We've got fewer homes on the lower value end and fewer homes on the higher value end. And effectively what this means is if we look at the kind of two tail ends of this distribution, since we have fewer homes in both the low and the high end, it's a little bit more difficult to establish certainty, right? We have a little bit more margin of error that happens. We have fewer transactions that are happening, and so our margins of error on the tail end tend to be a little bit higher than in the middle, where we have more properties to work with, we've got more transactions going on. So, I'm illustrating that here with just kind of a more wiggle on the tail ends is how we refer to this, right? The second driving factor here that we've seen is that a lot of the math that's used to assign value works off of central tendency. So mean, median, averages, which effectively kind of pulls values in towards the center. We call this, kind of regression to the mean, such that our lower valued homes kind of get pulled towards that $300,000 center, and our higher valued homes actually get pulled down towards the center, just in the process of working through some of the math that's used. So these two in combination, right, exert somewhat of an upward pressure on our lower valued homes and exert a downward pressure on our higher valued homes in Buncombe County. The other thing that we would expect to see, right, if we've got kind of more uncertainty on the tail ends, is that we might expect to see appeals happen more frequently at both the low and the high end. People saying, hey, assessor, I think you got my value off a little bit. You'd expect to see, both of those happening on the low and the high end. But as I mentioned, right, we're seeing participation in the appeals process highly skewed towards the higher end of the value spectrum, which is, again, placing additional downward pressure on the value on the higher value end of the spectrum, right? And so we're kind of asking the question, right, do those simple kind of math mechanics produce some of these over and under assessment trends that we're seeing? Perhaps, right? But then there may also be some situations in where human bias is involved. And I'll talk through this. So there's situations in which our assessor staff have to go out and make value decisions, have to make kind of use discretion or judgment. And, you know, a very simple example of this is just making the distinction between quality grades on different housing properties in our county. So we've got 6 housing grades from luxury to poor. Each one of these is assigned kind of a quality number, which then affects the math that's used to develop its assigned value. I can pick out the difference between a luxury and a poor, right? I could probably do that fairly easily, but making these nuanced distinctions between average and fair, superior and average may have, you know, kind of compounding implications if you know, there's judgment that needs to be happening here. And the thing I will just mention is that our assessor staff is a fairly small and nimble team, but is responsible for assessing 130,000 parcels, right? So you just think about what kind of the implications of that are. And so we've got quality, but we've also got condition adjustments. So whether or not a property is renovated or good, fair, normal, poor, all of these have implications on the math that's used to assign values here. And then the last one, kind of this big piece that I want to just spend a second unpacking is the process of extrapolating value from one market transaction to other homes in the area. Here in Buncombe County and in many of the locations that we're working in right now, use a convention to group homes into tax neighborhoods. And they'll use sales that exist within these tax neighborhoods to reassign value to homes within the same jurisdiction, within that same neighborhood. The issues that we see here, so I'll just kind of show you, this is, you know, just a patchwork quilt of tax neighborhoods on the north end of the city of Asheville. These tax neighborhoods that we're able to look at really don't mirror any of the neighborhoods that we're familiar with. And so we see them as being somewhat arbitrary and are at this point in time kind of uncertain about how they are delineated and produced. But I think what I want to just, again, spend a second and kind of pause to reflect on is Asheville, as many cities across the U.S., Asheville is one of the cities that implemented redlining in the 30s and did so for about a 30-year period. And this is a geographically based form of specifically racial discrimination in which homeowners of color may have found themselves in neighborhoods that were redlined and finding themselves unable to engage in lending, mortgages, and effectively unable to sell or transact their home in the marketplace. And if we're still using kind of these neighborhood delineations, I think the question I'm reflecting on right now is whether or not these tax neighborhoods are inadvertently kind of recycling some of the discrimination that may have been baked into kind of the geographic fabric of our communities from these decades of racist policies and practices. So I think this is an area for us to think about, you know, better math, better geographic approaches that we're not perhaps as subject to the discrimination that we've seen in the past. So real quick, I want to touch on some of the highlights. So we've taken this work and presented it here locally to community organizations, to our elected officials, to staff. We've seen some positive movement come from all of this. So the county has established an ad hoc advisory commission to go back and look at the entire reappraisal process and provide recommendations for how to do this process better, especially considering kind of the commitments to race equity. Several of our local cities, so Asheville, Woodfin, and Buncombe County, have passed homeowner tax relief programs. I'd love to talk through kind of my thoughts on these, but I'll leave my editorial comments for maybe our discussion. And then just real quickly, kind of kicking into what our next steps look like from here. We're fortunate to be working with a kind of a coalition of local partners, and we've received word that we've gotten some funding to expand this research to an 18-county region in Western North Carolina, which I'm very much looking forward to. This work will kick off in 2022, beginning of 2022, and be about a 2-year effort to take this work that we've done kind of at a pilot scale and take it even deeper, but then also expand the geographic scope to a wider area and hopefully, shed some light on perhaps some state policies that may be supportive in undoing the disparities that we're seeing in the tax administration process. So with that, I'll say thanks. I know I kind of ran through that quite quickly, but I'm looking forward to our conversations next. So I've included my email up there. Feel free to jot that down. And if you want to reach out outside this webinar, I'd be happy to chat more. So yeah.
Cool. Well, thanks, Ori. That's super helpful. I had only seen parts of that, and it's super interesting to see the whole rundown. I think one question that really occurs to me is, Urban3 is really well known for sort of being able to forecast and predict sort of like revenue and how money actually sort of returns in these kind of mechanisms to the county.
Yep.
Could you just talk a little bit about, one of the things that's striking to me, right, setting aside the equity considerations, right, is that this seems like it may not be the best way to get a return that makes sense for the county, right? Like this actually may not be the most cost-effective way of doing things. Sure. If you have highest value properties paying less in taxes than they effectively should. I was wondering if you could just talk about that. And we had talked about that a little bit. Do you even have a visual potentially to show us there? I just think that's like an interesting question to explore as we think about it.
Yeah. I don't have a visual produced, but I can to kind of talk through. I'll reference one visual, and that's the J-curve trend, right, which just shows that those lower value homes are being overassessed, the higher value homes are being underassessed. And yeah, you're teeing me up for a really great kind of analysis that we ran, which asked the question, if we were to readjust that over and under assessment such that everyone was assigned closer to their true market value, what does that look like from a revenue standpoint? Does the county lose money in the process of doing that? Does it cost the county additional funding to do that, right? And what we ended up finding is that the overassessment of the lower value homes was generating about $5 million in additional revenue a year. So that's about $5 million of effectively overtaxation of the lower valued homes. And equivalently, the undervaluation of the higher value homes was in the same ballpark of about $5 million annually. And so by actually readjusting those to be both net neutral, such that everyone's assessed fairly, is at best a neutral impact on the budget, right? If you're readjusting 5 million to 5 million, net neutral impact. Best case scenario when we ran these numbers was that the county actually received additional funding because of that readjusting the higher end of the spectrum to its fair market value actually produced more revenue for the county overall.
Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah.
Another question, and I see that we have a couple questions that I'll try to get to in the comments too. But another thing that occurs to me, and this is maybe editorial, but you mentioned statewide policy. Is that sort of the level of government that you think makes sense to sort of consider some policy changes rather than, for example, the county where some of these things are being calculated?
Yeah. My kind of knee-jerk response to that is both. My experience so far in Buncombe County, looking at state legislation and kind of the requirements that are placed on a county by state legislation, is that the state is actually fairly loose in its requirements for counties. So there's actually quite a bit of laterality. There's a couple of really big benchmarks that need to happen according to state legislation. One of those is like the reassessment needs to happen every 8 years, right? Like that's a big benchmark that needs to happen. There's some nuanced kind of calculations that if your average sales ratio drops below 85%, that has to trigger a new reassessment. But by and large, there's quite a bit of flexibility for the local jurisdictions to think about ways that this can be done locally. And so some of the things that we're thinking about locally is, right, 4 years, 8 years is a long period to wait in between reassessment. So is 4 years, right? And so there's no reason why a county could not engage in an annual reassessment. That comes with perhaps additional resources, additional capacity for staff, but in the process of doing that, they may be able to really dial in on the process and not let 4 years of drift happen between market and assessed values. So I think there's definitely opportunities at a state level to help support local policy, but I think there's a lot of stuff that can be done under the existing state legislation that counties can kind of adopt better just standards of practice, if you will.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting to think about sort of like where the potential policy change should be targeted or addressed.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
all right, so let's hit some of the questions we have in the comments here. The first one is sort of data related, and I think you may know this offhand, Ori, but sale prices, is that public information in North Carolina? Is that recorded by the assessor as well?
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I don't know. Actually don't know which office is responsible for maintaining that data, but it is publicly available, and we have it, accessible in a spreadsheet format, essentially.
Got it.
Yeah.
And then Glenn also asks, what would it look like to compare commercial properties to residential properties? Have you looked at commercial properties at all?
That's a great question, and I will kind of caveat that answer with the work that we've done so far has been kind of entirely in-house. It's just been a pet project, if you will, and so we've had to kind of balance our time and our commitment to it. And so unfortunately, we haven't been able to really look at commercial property as extensively as we have with residential property. I will say we did the pick and poke analysis, right, which is just looking at different properties, and we see similar curiosities in the commercial realm. I'll just kind of anecdotally provide one. We've got a vacant Kmart building on a primary commercial corridor in Asheville. That entire Kmart is assessed at $200. The building is $200. That's like half a cent per square foot, right? So we're just kind of curious when we see things like that pop up and what the implications are for commercial real estate as well. So that's where we're fortunate in getting this additional funding to expand the scope and breadth of this work. We'll definitely be including commercial properties in the analysis as we move forward.
And speaking of that, I also wonder if you could talk a little bit more, sort of coming from I live in Cleveland, sort of Regrid is sort of deeply embedded in sort of the property tax issues up in Detroit, right? And the resulting fallout of the housing crisis and all that.
Mm-hmm.
So from where I sit, I feel like when we talk about over and under assessments, a lot of the harms that are done to folks on sort of like the lower end, the lower quintiles of the spectrum in terms of housing value is involved with paying lots of taxes that maybe they can't actually afford to pay, right? Displacement, stuff like that. But, I know you have a public health background, and I'm curious to hear you talk a little bit about, so when we're looking at this through a public health lens, like how do you make that connection sort of between these types of phenomena we're seeing in the data, and then sort of like what are the outcomes that you're concerned about or looking at?
Yeah, that's a big one to kind of unpack, and I appreciate that question. I think you've already touched on quite a few of the intersections between this work and public health outcomes, and that is the idea that if we're placing additional financial burden on low-income residents, low-income communities of color, that's requiring a financial trade-off, right? Whether or not they're reinvesting in maintaining the quality and condition of their home, right? Whether or not this is jeopardizing the safety and integrity of their living space, or making trade-offs on kind of daily basic needs, be it transportation, food options, access to recreation, right? So there's a huge financial component to this, which I think is a little bit more well recognized and perhaps a little bit easier to make those connections. I think the one that I am particularly intrigued by and will be kind of spending the next 2 years looking at is the idea that property taxes represent a bulk of local government budgets, right? So in Buncombe County, in North Carolina, counties on average, the revenue is about 50% from property taxes, if not more. So like 50 to 70% comes from property taxes. And so if we're thinking about initiatives that are led from the public space, right? So public health initiatives would be a great one. I'll give an example from my background, thinking about access to park and rec spaces. So kind of like park equity work that's being done from a physical activity standpoint. If those improvements to park access or programming are being funded through public sources of revenue, right, property taxes, and yet those property taxes are being generated in a way that places undue financial burden on low-income communities of color, right? Can these initiatives and these programs that are claiming to advance health equity or race equity be entirely equitable if their source of financing isn't to begin with. And so I think that connection is the one that I'm really going to be looking at most closely as we move forward.
Yeah, to that point, Glenn asked another question, which sort of ties right into that, which is, is there, either for you personally or sort of in the conversations that you're around, is there any thinking about sort of like doing away with the property tax and switching to a different funding method entirely? One that's less based on these sort of subjective variables.
Mm-hmm. That's a question that, as we've presented this work, it's one that it pops up time and time again, right? I think from a strict kind of Urban3 ethos, those of you that may be tuning in that are familiar with kind of Urban3's body of work, we look at this as a cost and revenue standpoint, and we see situations in land development patterns in which I'll give like a classic example, right? Typical subdivision development, single family residential, requires a lot of kind of distributed infrastructure, right? So street networks, your sanitary sewer, your water, your electrical is all fairly distributed. So from a cost perspective, it's very expensive to maintain development like that. And then its return, right? Single family residential kind of distributed like that has a very low return from a property tax perspective. And so, I think we are constantly kicking around the idea of, what if there were a system that was based off of kind of cost or infrastructure requirements, such that every land development pattern was kind of paying its fair share of infrastructure requirements. So what that looks like, the mechanics behind it, are one that we're kind of constantly thinking about. But I think it's a great question, and one that deserves definitely a lot of thought as we move forward.
Yeah. It's interesting. Up here, a lot of the conversation about the property tax ties back to school districts and sort of inequitable outcomes in that direction, right? Because, especially up north, a lot of the sort of the manifestations of racism are sort of like embodied in this sort of like a lot of suburbs that are fractured, right, and providing different services than the central city. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I don't know. It's an interesting sort of the nexus there is interesting between property taxes. Is there a better way, and sort of like how actually do these affect people on the ground?
Yeah, Nick, the one other thing I'll mention is that when we've kicked around this work to a couple of different organizations, another thing that's always asked is like, what about programs like Prop 13 in California, which limit the increase in assessed value and property taxes, or like Homestead Exemption in Florida, which caps it at 3% or CPI. Is that a viable solution, right? Especially when you think about the 700% increase over the last 20 years, right? Is that an option to kind of combat what we're seeing? And I think what I would respond to with that question is that those programs layer on kind of an additional complexity to the tax system, and may end up creating some externalities that are unintended, and one of which is like restricting local government's ability to kind of generate revenue. And so I think whatever solution is put in place is one that needs to be fairly straightforward, digestible, and doesn't have a lot of like layered complexity to it, would be my like a big picture recommendation so that we think about solutions.
Yeah, to that point, I'll steer away from the tax abatement questions because I think that's like an interesting thing, but maybe a conversation for another day. I was going to ask you, I believe it was some of Chris Berry's nationwide research that he was doing. He said that he thought that about a third of the disparities that were noted could be fixed in basically tweaks to the algorithm. Mm-hmm. Which I think is obviously, that seems like the easiest place to start, right? Is sort of the algorithmic stuff. But I would be curious maybe to get your take a little bit on sort of homestead exemptions as a mechanism, maybe to sort of help out those on the lower quintiles of the spectrum, because you're right, like there's extra sort of like overhead in administering it, but also, maybe that's one of these ways there's a bulwark against sort of overtaxing folks. So I'm curious to know what you think about that.
Yeah. I think I absolutely, I see the value. I see the intended outcomes of programs like that, but I think my inclination would be to perhaps separate those two such that the the tax administration process wasn't also including the intended like creating that as a program that layers onto an equitable tax system to begin with, right? And then going back and layering on a homeowners assistance program or something that's specifically targeted towards lower income communities, right, for long-term home ownership, but not having that be intricately interwoven into the property tax system itself is one that I see as being kind of a best possible solution there.
Sure.
Yeah.
Any other sort of like big policy sort of interventions or tweaks that you can think of off the top that sort of you'd be a big fan of implementing with an eye to sort of getting this disparity down?
I mean, I've already mentioned one of them, right, which is let's not wait. So a classic example, right, is we present this work to local elected officials and staff and the community, and we get kind of the feedback of, well, we'll fix it 4 years from now, right, because they were on this 4-year schedule, and yet there's no reason why this couldn't be reassessed next year, right? Why can't we just immediately adopt an annual reassessment cycle to make sure that we're catching these discrepancies as they happen and not just sitting on our hands for 4 years? So that's one that could happen, right now. That doesn't require any sort of policy change to do that. That's a standard of practice that could change. I think there's a lot of, again, kind of practice-based work that could be implemented around the appeals process, right? I showed that folks at the higher end of the homeowner value spectrum tend to participate in the appeals process a little bit more. I think that's a function of kind of awareness, ability to engage in that whole system. So I think there's a lot of work that can be done to make that more of a streamlined and accessible part of the reappraisal process. I mean, I think those are really the big ones. And, this isn't necessarily as policy driven, but when we think about the early slide that I presented, which is the equation for your property tax bill, which is your assessed value, your tax rate equals your tax bill. When we think of tax rate, right, that is something that's established during the budget cycle generally. And this is usually, my experience has been, this is a month-long process. There's a lot of civic dialogue around the budget, around the tax rate, a lot of engagement. The assessed value side of things, and in my experience with Buncombe County, there was very little civic engagement or kind of dialogue around that entire process. So just to kind of point this out, this is the standards of value document, which is the outcome of the reappraisal process. This is a 655-page document that underpins that assessed value. This document was approved in 7 minutes with no public conversation around it. So from a practice standpoint, right, how can we get better engagement? My suggestion there would be, right, let's not do 655-page entirely table-filled documents, right? So if we can switch to a visualization mechanism such that folks can see, interpret, plug into the data far more quickly, see some of these anomalies that are happening, iterate over them quicker, would be a best case scenario.
Sure. So anybody who wants to ask a question, go ahead and ask. We've got about 5 minutes left, more or less, here. The other thing that I am curious to know, but I feel like as moderator, one of the perks is being able to ask questions that are not directly related and see what people say.
Sure.
Which is the other thing that was really interesting to me as sort of like a semi-recent homeowner is the impact on sort of being able to get a loan of what your property is valued at, right? Mm-hmm. It strikes me that, especially post housing crisis with sort of increased regulations and a higher reliance on comps, right? That sort of a lot of what we're looking at here might also have direct impacts on sort of how the housing market operates. I'm wondering if that's sort of an area of interest for you all, or if you've considered sort of diving into that at some point.
Yes, absolutely. And so I think there's like a couple of different layers to all of this. And so there's the appraisal, right, which is generally used to determine lending potential, your ability to get financing for something. So that's usually done at a property by property basis. You've got your market price, which is what a home or property actually sold for on the market, and then you've got assessed value, right? And how those three numbers kind of intersect is really kind of a fascinating space of work. I will say personally, from experience from a data perspective, getting data on appraisals, right, which is individual kind of home by home, lender by lender, has been far more challenging, if almost non-existent at this point in time, than assessment data and even market data. So I know that under the current administration, the Biden administration, there's a real big push to think about how do we perhaps centralize some appraisal data, what that might look like to get some of that going, which would allow some really great conversation and dialogue to happen between appraisals and assessments. So yeah, we'd love to head down that path. We just, as soon as the data is available, we'll go there.
Yeah. To sort of round out, I think another question, I just sort of wanted to sort of just like delve maybe a little bit into sort of the nerdy data analysis side, just for a quick second, which is to say, like, could you tell us a little bit more? I mean, so for the things that you're looking at, when you were looking at the county level, sort of within the county where you were using county data, was your universe of analysis the properties that had sold? So you had hard numbers both for sales and assessed. Is that right?
Yes. Yep. So our sample of homes that we had assessment data for was larger than the pool that we had sales data for. And I mean, the way we kind of approached this was we looked again at like a 20-year time frame, and we were able to compare a transaction that happened to its most recent assessment value, and keep those as aligned as possible there. We did a little bit of, this is kind of getting into the nerdy stuff, but there's some things that you need to think about, like whether or not a home underwent renovation and in between the time that it was assigned an assessed value versus the time that it sold, right? So if you have an assessed value, it gets renovated, the market can determine and value that renovation, but your assessed value can't. So it would be, not appropriate to compare those two. So we had to drop homes that had been renovated. We excluded unqualified, this is another big data consideration, unqualified sales. So we only included like arm's length transactions in this analysis. So there are situations in which, a simple example would be if I sold my home to my brother and felt like giving him a good price, right? That's not truly reflective of the market, and that's considered an unqualified sale. We're able to determine that in the data that we have, the distinction between a qualified and unqualified sale. So making sure that we're excluding anything that doesn't represent a true kind of market transaction under ideal conditions, we excluded those from the analysis as well.
Cool. And then another question that I think is pretty right down that sort of line of thinking is, so given that you were sort of working with the county to get this data, right, and then you were analyzing it, was the appraisal district concerned, or what was their sort of reaction to the work that was done, given sort of what you found here?
That's a great question. So I'd say we've had like three broad audiences that we've presented this work to. First of which is the community, and we did that, individual by individual or community organizations, neighborhood groups, right? And by and large, folks were very receptive to this work. And I think the feedback that we got there was that people were experiencing this, but we kind of showed them a new way of looking at it and thinking about it. So a fairly easy adoption of the work. We presented it to elected officials, so both our city and county commissioners, again, most of whom leaned into the work, and we're asking questions of what do I do as an elected official to support policy that can help adjust these. And then we did present to staff. So we did present this directly to the county assessor's office, or our chief assessor, and several members of his staff. And the conversation was challenging. It was a challenging conversation, and it's one that's still kind of evolving. I think we're in conversations about, we're working with data that's produced specifically by your office. We've found this work. We're a qualified team. We'd like to have you all kind of explain and walk through if you're seeing something different. It's a strained dialogue right now, but one that hopefully with some additional work we'll be able to be more fruitful and productive. So a little bit of a political answer there, but yeah.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's one of those real considerations, right? Because on the one hand, you want people to buy in, and on the other hand, right, like there really are questions around like, well, if this is the case, then we should do something to make it different, right? So I think there always has to be that sort of like political dialogue,
Yep.
At the end of the day.
And that's why I think we've been fortunate to have good reception. It's been well received by our elected officials who can kind of help support better conversation between really the community and the staff, right? And that's what this boils down to.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Cool. Well, in an attempt to end punctually here, Ori, thank you so much for this. I really appreciate you taking the time. Any final thoughts you want to impart here before we leave?
I would say that if, you've found this work interesting and you want to kind of follow along, we're, like I said, expanding this work into an 18-county area. We'll have a website launched here fairly soon. We'll have a kind of a routine listserv. So if you want to stay tuned, hop on the Urban3 website. I think I'll probably pass that along to Nick. So if you want to find it from one of the two of us, you'll be able to kind of stay tuned. I'd love additional conversation, feedback, anything along this would be certainly helpful. So feel free to reach out. And Nick, thank you for the opportunity. I've enjoyed this, and I think I always enjoy nerding out over this kind of stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. All right, Ori, and everybody listening. Thank you very much for attending. I think it's been really interesting. Feel free, Nick at Regrid, Ori had his details there, and we'll also, when the webcast is the recording is made available, we'll also make sure that we have some links there to get back to Urban3.
Perfect.
Cool. All right, thanks everybody.
Thanks, Nick. Thanks, guys. Bye.
See you, Ori.